Welcome back to Dark Character Profiler and to the Dark Archive Bureau, sometimes simply known as the Archive, where I, Fulcrum, dissect the minds behind the cases most people would rather leave closed. This case wasn't submitted through Gateway. I came across it while reviewing a set of reports tied to corporate influence and behavioral control. At first, it looked routine, disconnected incidents, different locations, unrelated outcomes. But one name kept appearing, not always in the same place, and not always for the same reason. What stayed consistent was the pattern around it. People responded with fear, loyalty, or both. Decisions changed in his presence. Outcomes shifted in ways that didn't follow normal organizational logic. That kind of pattern usually points to a strong authority figure, but this felt different. It suggested something more centralized and more absolute. The name at the center of that pattern was Homelander. At that point, it stopped being a set of reports and became a case. What follows is not just a profile of an individual, but an examination of what happens when a person is created to hold power without the structure required to manage it. Let's begin.
Welcome to Dark Character Profiler. Take a deep dive into the background and personalities of villains from books, video games, manga, and comics. Psychological analysis of some of the most deviant and heinous characters of all time. Now, here's Fulcrum.
Every story has a villain, but not every villain is simple. Here, we go beyond good and evil to ask harder questions. What shaped them? What broke them? And at what point does survival become monstrosity?
Dark Character Profile.
Listener discretion is advised. This episode includes discussions of severe psychological trauma, violence, abuse, and exploitation. All analysis is presented for educational and entertainment purposes only and does not constitute professional diagnosis, psychological treatment, or medical advice. The material is examined analytically and without glorification, but it may still be distressing. If you need to pause, skip, or step away, please do so.
Dark Character Profile.
When most people look at Homelander, they see control. He presents himself as confident, composed, and completely aware of the effect he has on others. His public image is carefully maintained, and it is designed to communicate safety, authority, and reliability. However, the reactions he produces tell a different story. People do not relax around him. They become cautious, attentive, and in many cases, afraid. That contrast between presentation and reaction is where the psychological complexity begins. Homelander was not raised in a typical environment. He was developed within a system that prioritized performance and control over emotional development. As a result, many of the processes that normally shape identity, such as attachment, boundaries, and internal regulation, were either disrupted or never fully formed. This case focuses on how that kind of development affects a person over time. More specifically, it looks at how power, when combined with unstable identity and unmet emotional needs, can produce behavior that is both controlled and unpredictable. Background information. Homelander's background is defined by design rather than upbringing. He was created and raised within a controlled laboratory environment managed by a corporate organization. The goal of that environment was not to support normal development, but to produce a highly capable and controlled asset. He did not have parents in the traditional sense. Instead, he was exposed to a rotating group of supervisors, researchers, and authority figures. These individuals were responsible for monitoring his behavior, testing his abilities, and shaping his responses. They were not responsible for forming emotional bonds. Because of this, Homelander's development was structured around performance. When he behaved in ways that aligned with expectations, he received approval. When he did not, that approval was withdrawn or replaced with correction. Over time, this created a system where his sense of self became tied to how others responded to him. This is important because it means he did not develop an internal sense of identity. Instead, his identity became dependent on external feedback. He learned what he needed to be in order to receive validation, but he did not develop a stable understanding of who he was independently of that process. Trauma history. Homelander's trauma is not the result of a single event. It is the result of a developmental environment that lacked the elements required for healthy psychological growth. One of the most significant factors is the absence of stable attachment. In early development, consistent caregivers help regulate emotional responses and provide a sense of safety. Homelander did not have that. Instead, his environment was structured around observation and evaluation. When he experienced distress, he was not comforted in a typical way. His reactions were monitored. When he was confused or uncertain, he was not guided through those experiences. He was tested. This type of environment does not eliminate emotional responses. It prevents the individual from learning how to manage them. Another important factor is the use of conditional approval. Attention and recognition were tied to performance. This creates dependency on external validation because approval is no longer a constant. It becomes something that has to be earned and maintained. Over time, this combination of factors produces a specific pattern. The individual develops a strong need for connection and validation, but does not develop the tools required to form stable relationships. As a result, they may seek approval while also distrusting the people they rely on to provide it. Mental state. Homelander's mental state can be understood as controlled on the surface but unstable underneath. He is capable of maintaining composure in most situations, and he is highly aware of how to present himself. This suggests a strong ability to monitor and adjust his behavior in real time. However, this control is not the same as emotional stability. It is better understood as a learned behavior that allows him to maintain his image. The underlying emotional system remains reactive. When he experiences emotions such as rejection, humiliation, or loss of control, those reactions are intense. Because he was not taught how to regulate those emotions, he relies on suppression. This works temporarily, but it does not resolve the underlying response. When that suppression fails, his behavior can change quickly. The shift is not gradual. It moves from controlled to extreme in a short period of time. Importantly, he remains aware of what he is doing during these moments. The issue is not a loss of awareness, but a lack of internal restraint. Fulcrum's personality breakdown, the hurricane scale. Before analyzing Homelander's personality, I want to outline the system used to assess emotional states. Category 1 means subtle wins and manageable emotions, through Category 5, which is total internal upheaval. Homelander's emotional profile reflects high intensity across multiple areas, with particular emphasis on control and instability. Imagination and insight. Category 3. He is perceptive in social situations, particularly when it comes to recognizing fear and compliance. However, his interpretations are limited by his belief in his own superiority, which reduces his ability to understand others accurately. Control and order. Category 5. Control is central to how he functions. It is not just a preference, it is a requirement for maintaining his identity. When that control is challenged, his response is to increase pressure rather than adapt. Social energy. Category 3. He is comfortable in highly visible environments, but these interactions are performance-based. He does not engage in mutual social exchange in a meaningful way. Compassion and cooperation. Category 1. His capacity for empathy is minimal. While he can recognize emotional states in others, this awareness is typically used to maintain control rather than to support or connect. And finally, unpredictability. Category 5. His behavior appears stable as long as his environment supports his needs. When those needs are threatened, his responses can become extreme with little warning. Moral beliefs. Homelander's moral framework is based on hierarchy rather than shared standards. He does not evaluate actions based on external rules or collective values. Instead, he interprets right and wrong through his position relative to others. Because he sees himself as superior, his actions are not subject to the same evaluation he applies to other people. If he does something, it is justified within his framework. If someone challenges him, that challenge is interpreted as defiance rather than disagreement. This creates a system where obedience is viewed as positive and resistance is viewed as a threat. It also means that his behavior is not guided by a consistent ethical structure. Instead, it is guided by what maintains his authority and reinforces his identity. Relationships. Homelander's relationships are shaped by need rather than mutual connection. Because he did not develop secure attachment early in life, his interactions with others are often unstable and dependent on how those individuals affect his sense of self. Madeline Stillwell. His relationship with Madeline reflects a form of conditional attachment. He seeks approval and validation from her, but also reacts strongly when that approval is threatened. This creates a dynamic that alternates between dependence and resentment. The public. His relationship with the public is based on visibility and validation. He relies on their admiration to maintain his identity, but he does not engage with them as individuals. They function as a source of feedback rather than as people with independent value. Queen Maeve. With Queen Maeve, the dynamic is different. Maeve is one of the few individuals who understands his behavior and does not fully submit to it. This creates tension because her perspective cannot be easily controlled. The Seven. Within the Seven, relationships are structured around hierarchy. Homelander does not operate as part of a team. He positions himself above the group, and any deviation from that structure is treated as a problem that needs to be corrected. Ryan Butcher. His relationship with Ryan introduces a different dynamic. Ryan represents an opportunity for connection, but also an extension of his identity. Because Homelander lacks a model for healthy guidance, he approaches this relationship by projecting his own beliefs and expectations rather than adapting to Ryan's needs. Historical parallels. Homelander's behavior reflects patterns seen in individuals who operate within systems of unchecked power and controlled public perception. First, we have Caligula. Caligula demonstrated how authority without restraint can lead to unpredictable and extreme behavior. His perception of power influenced how he interpreted reality, similar to Homelander's approach. Next, we have Kim Jong-il. Kim Jong-il represents the role of controlled public image and enforced admiration. In both cases, external validation is structured and maintained rather than naturally earned. Next is Lance Armstrong. And I know this one might sound surprising, but hear me out. Lance Armstrong provides a parallel in terms of identity construction. His public image became central to his sense of self, and protecting that image became a priority. Next, we have Joseph Stalin. Joseph Stalin reflects the use of fear and control to maintain authority. In both cases, opposition is treated as a threat that must be removed. And finally, we have Elizabeth Holmes. Elizabeth Holmes illustrates how belief in a constructed identity can override objective reality, leading to decisions that prioritize perception over truth.
And now, the final analysis. But first, just a little house cleaning.
Before we examine the crimes and potential diagnoses, a brief reminder. This analysis is presented for educational and entertainment purposes only.
Dark character profile.
Criminal behavior. Homelander's criminal behavior develops within a system that limits accountability. Early in his career, his actions are managed by external oversight, which focuses on maintaining public image rather than enforcing consistent consequences. As that oversight weakens, his behavior becomes more closely tied to his emotional state. Actions that were once controlled begin to reflect personal reactions, particularly in response to perceived threats or challenges. At later stages, his behavior is guided almost entirely by his internal logic. If he believes an action is justified, he proceeds without regard for external rules. This results in a pattern of behavior where violence is used to maintain control and reinforce his position. Psychological testing. If Homelander was assessed using modern psychological measures, the result would indicate significant disruption in attachment, identity formation, and emotional regulation. His stress response would likely show instability tied to interpersonal triggers, particularly those involving rejection or loss of control. His impulsivity would appear moderate overall, but increase significantly during emotionally charged situations. Empathy would be identified as impaired. While he can recognize emotional states in others, this recognition does not lead to pro-social behavior. Instead, it is used to guide his responses. His sense of self would be described as unstable and externally dependent. Grandiosity would be present, but it would require continuous reinforcement to remain intact. DSM-5-TR Diagnostic Criteria Breakdown. Everything we've discussed so far explains how Homelander behaves. This section focuses on how those behaviors align with clinical diagnostic criteria. First, we have narcissistic personality disorder. DSM-5-TR requirements. Homelander meets the DSM-5-TR criteria for narcissistic personality disorder. He demonstrates a pervasive pattern of grandiosity, need for admiration, and lack of empathy. He shows a strong belief in his own superiority and expects recognition without question. He relies on external validation to maintain his self-image and reacts negatively when that validation is threatened. His interactions with others are often exploitative, and he does not respond to their emotional needs in a meaningful way. Overall, he meets the required number of criteria for diagnosis. Diagnosis: narcissistic personality disorder, severe. Second, we have antisocial personality features. The DSM-5 TR requirements are a pattern of disregard for the rights of others. Homelander demonstrates several behaviors associated with antisocial patterns, including disregard for the safety of others, use of deception, and lack of remorse. However, there is insufficient evidence of early conduct disorder, which is required for a full diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder. Thus, the diagnosis is antisocial traits, subclinical. Next, we have reactive attachment disorder. DSM-5 TR context. Severe neglect and lack of attachment in early childhood can impair emotional bonding. Homelander's early environment lacked stable attachment figures, which significantly affected his ability to form relationships. He shows difficulty with emotional connection, dependence on validation, and instability in interpersonal interactions. These features are consistent with severe disruption in attachment development. Clinical consideration: severe attachment disturbance. Diagnoses that were considered but ruled out. Post-traumatic stress disorder, not met. His behavior is not driven by intrusive memories, avoidance, or trauma-specific triggers. His instability is more closely tied to identity and attachment. Obsessive-compulsive personality disorder, not met. Although he seeks control, this is related to dominance rather than rigid adherence to rules or perfectionism. Final impressions. When reviewing Homelander's case, the most consistent pattern is not his use of power, but his dependence on validation. His behavior is shaped by a need to be recognized and reinforced, which developed in an environment where approval was conditional and attachment was absent. This creates a situation where he presents as highly confident but relies heavily on external feedback to maintain that state. When that feedback is stable, his behavior appears controlled. When it is threatened, his responses become more extreme. He does not function as an independent identity in the traditional sense. Instead, his sense of self is closely tied to how others perceive him. This makes his behavior difficult to predict because it depends on factors outside of his direct control. In the end, Homelander represents the outcome of a system that prioritizes performance over development. He was given the ability to influence others at a high level, but was not given the structure required to manage that influence internally. This file is closed, but not everything in the archive stays buried. I'll see you in the next case.
Dark Character Profile.
Dark Character Profiler is produced and edited by Fulcrum under Dark Fulcrum Media. If you enjoyed this episode, consider following the show or sharing it with someone who loves psychology, storytelling, and morally complex characters. You can find links, references, and related material in the show notes. Until next time, remember, the most terrifying monsters are rarely born. They're shaped.
Thank you for listening to Dark Character Profiler with Fulcrum. Listen every other Tuesday on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Podcasts. Humanity was not meant to live this way. Society is left to the mercy of murderers and cutthroats. Hear Paige Zaplin-Dam's epic tale brought to life in an audiobook. For years, Slade had felt secure in the forest. I am from simple, humble beginnings. I was raised in the Ironwood by an ogress, an Anaral. He saw immediately that she was beyond a healer's aid. Even a skilled witch could not help her recover from losing so much blood. Mother? Slade thought he wanted revenge. Instead, he got redemption. A kingdom of ash and steam, The Ogress's Son, a dystopian neo-Dark Age fantasy, narrated by Rich Fraser. Now available on iTunes and Audible. I promise you I will find whoever did this and avenge you, Mother.